Now back to the introduction to the framework of the Open for Business project. Over on the right side here in this blue box is some general information, some kind of high-level information about some of the concepts behind the framework, and we'll go over these briefly. The general idea behind the framework is to provide tools that work well together and allow you to create enterprise software staying as close to the business level, as close to design artifacts basically as possible. There are various best practices tools that are part of the Open for Business project that provide for these sorts of things, modeling information structures, processes, implementing the automated business processes, and modeling user interaction, and then actually implementing that user interaction. The general goal of the Open for Business project tools is to get close to a 4GL level of productivity, but without some of the limits and flexibility that are typically a problem with 4GL tools and applications created using those tools. We also want to have a true enterprise multi-tier architecture with independent artifacts in the various tiers and in various parts of the applications that can be easily reused and can also work together even though they are and sometimes implemented using very different tools. So we have tools in place to pretty much develop entire applications using XML files that represent different aspects of an application, and we'll go over those in detail as part of this overview. In addition to these primary best practices tools, we have secondary best practices tools like Java methods, FreeMarker templates. FreeMarker is the preferred tool that we use for templating, and Bean Shell scripts. Bean Shell is the preferred tool for scripting, and it is basically just a scripting language based on the Java syntax, but with additional flexibility that's normally found in scripting languages like automatic or dynamic typing, runtime interpretation, and so on. So as a general rule for Open for Business, as described in this last paragraph here, we're trying to implement these things using the least amount of code possible. In some cases that means sacrificing some of the flexibility in order to use the higher level tools and create something more quickly, although that's not always a bad thing. In fact, sometimes it is very good for improving consistency as well as making it easier for end users to move around and assimilate the applications, and for customizers or developers to understand the system and be able to modify it or create derivative works based on it. These dynamic tools are an alternative basically to the approach of code generation, where there's some sort of a seed file that is fed through a code generation. Code comes out the other end that's compiled and run. With these tools, we're using more of an interpretation technique where we have very similar files going in the front, but coming out the back, rather than generating code that can be compiled and run, the tools simply interact with the lower level resources and perform the necessary operations. This allows us to work on a much higher level and is very similar to a model view controller type of pattern, where there's an internal model, the lower level resources, an external view, which is the APIs and XML files for the various tools in the Open for Business framework, and the controller, which is the intermediary that sits between them, which are the various OFBiz tools like the entity engine, the service engine, and so on. For example, with the entity engine, we have entity definitions in an XML file that describes the structure of the entity model, how the various entities, their fields, how they relate to each other, higher level things like view entities made up of multiple entities that can be operated on the same as a normal entity, and then an API for performing basic operations like find operations and CRUD, or create, update, and delete operations. That would be the view side of it. The controller is the entity engine itself that translates from the view side to the model side, which is the database itself that the entity engine interacts with using JDBC. So it generates the SQL, performs the JDBC calls and so forth on behalf of the higher level code. This allows us to stick to what we care more about as we're working with the business requirements and developing based on design artifacts, so that we can create something as close as possible and as concise as possible to the design artifacts themselves. In general, we're following the sort of 80-20 rule, where the intent is that the tools, these very high-level tools, can be used around 80% of the time and require about 20% of the work that would normally be required for the development. And also, this basically leaves more time to either do tight iterations and refine what's created, or spend the remaining time on focusing on lower level artifacts that are created for parts of the applications that need to be very flexible and that these higher level tools don't necessarily cover easily. So the goal is less code, more consistency among the code. Following these general patterns, it's easy to pick up code that someone else has worked on and know basically how it's laid out and be able to work with it efficiently. So we'll be talking about in this framework overview, first, a discussion of this artifact reference diagram. We'll talk about the preferred development flow. This is, of course, after design is done, but basically doing a bottom-up development, starting with the data layer, moving to the logic, and then the user interface layer. And then we will look at some of the detailed resources themselves that are part of the example component in OFBiz, including the data model there, the entity definitions, the service definitions, the seed data, and the service implementations. We'll also move on into the user interface level artifacts, the screen definitions, form definitions, and so on.